Some of that I think comes from just the pressures that you have around you to, for it to be specifically about football. And why bring your religion, why bring your faith or any other thing into this context when we're here for football? Especially at the professional level, because that's your job. And so, you know, I don't necessarily think it's something that is, looked down upon, but I don't think that people that are Christians, like such as myself, like my faith is my biggest thing, but even I, would have a hard time sometimes speaking up, because you don't know, where everybody else stands, and we're called as Christians to, to spread the gospel, and you can only do that through, you can do it through your actions, but you can really only speak about Jesus through your words, and so being able to build up the courage regardless of what you think other people may think about you, or if it's the right place at the right time, it's the right thing to do. But in a high pressure situation or in an environment where you don't know other guys' beliefs and stuff, sometimes that's hard, and occasionally it may be something that people may talk down upon, but more than anything I feel like it's just something that people are scared to speak up for fear of criticism.
Yeah. So before you say you kind of came into your own with your faith, when you were in high school, how would you say your identity shifted from when you were in high school to when you were in college?
It was really big identity shift, because my whole life, from the time I could walk, was about football, and so, or it seemed that way. My dad was a high school coach for 34 years, and I grew up being his ball boy, watching my older brother play, football for my dad, and so from the time I could walk, I think I found a lot of my value in who I was as a player, and how I performed on the field, and the higher up that I made it, the more accomplishments that I had. It felt like that became more and more of my identity and who I was, and it was certainly, I think, as I got into college, something that people recognized me for was not for my faith. It was for what I was doing on the football field. So I think in high school, it was my identity was all in just strictly who I was as a football player. And when I got into college, from the outside world, people that are watching games on TV, they're watching the Longhorns and all that, they might not necessarily realize how big of a deal my faith is to me. But I know for me personally, just my identity and where I found myself and where I found my self-worth, I realized that I'm not the person that is on the football field all the time. I'm a person that is also a Christian. I'm a person who's also, I'm a brother. Now I'm a father. I'm a husband, and so there's much more to my life than just a sport. And so being able to pull myself away from, hey, you're much more than the performance that you had on the field, because if you constantly try to find your identity in who you are in what you do, whether that's work or whether that's in sports or whatever, then it's mountains and valleys all the time, because you're going to have days where you're on top of the world, and you'll have days where you perform very poorly and you're at the very, very bottom, and you feel like that's where your self-worth is. So I think when I realized that my identity was founded in Christ, and that's where my worth came from, I was a lot more level, I think, and the highs weren't necessarily so high and the lows weren't so low, but that's a good place to be. I felt like it was more here as opposed to peaks and valleys.
Yeah. So what if you can think of any, I guess, specific example of an experience with somebody who has a different identity than you do? So your identity is in your faith. What are the downfalls that you've seen in your experience, like at UT or in the pros, with people who their identity is in their performance?
I think the biggest thing that you see is just people, sometimes they hate themselves, because as much as they want to perform at a high level, there are times, whether it's outside of your own circumstances, some guys just get beat, and they gave their all, but they just weren't good enough. And so that leaves you feeling like, I'm just not good enough, and this is, I have all my eggs in this basket, and if it doesn't work out here, then I'm nothing, and so I think a lot of times you see both with performance but also with injury. You put all your eggs in this basket, and you don't spend time developing yourself, in your faith or in your friendships or whatever it may be, and then when that sport is taken from you, involuntarily through something like an accident or something like an injury that you have, you see a lot of identity crisis happen in that situation, because their whole life revolved around who they were, in the specific sport. And when it's taken from them, they don't know who they are. And I've seen that a lot with guys, and they struggle with it, and they start dealing with ways to cope, and sometimes that ends up being alcohol, that ends up being drugs, that ends up being some form of other type of addiction, or something that they're trying to cope with the pain of not having what they found their identity in, and not being associated with that, and people not seeing them for like Jaxon Shipley, the football player. Now it's like, okay, well, you're Jaxon Shipley, but you're not a football player, so what's your worth? What are you worth to me? And so I think that's hard, because our culture, I think, plays into that too, because we put these athletes and these people that are famous on these pedestals, almost like they're not human. And when you get to a point where you're not in the limelight anymore, you're not in the spotlight, and you have nothing to offer the world, then it can very easily be a trap that you fall into.
Yeah. So going back to your time at UT, just kind of go into a little more what the culture was like in the locker room around the team regarding religion. If there was any talk about it, or if you mentioned that it wasn't really not necessarily a bad thing, but it just wasn't brought up much.
Yeah, I think there's in college, you're at this place in your life where you're on your own for the first time a lot of times for most people, and they have a lot of freedom to choose and pick and choose what they want to do and what they want to spend their time on, and so you get in a locker room and you've got a lot of people talking about they did this with this girl, or they took they experimented with this whatever it was, or they drank so much that they can't walk the next day. And it's like, it's funny to a lot of people, but then when you sit back and think about it, it's pretty sad really to think these 18-year-old 19-year-old kids, these are the stuff that they're that they find their happiness in, or try to find their happiness in. They're searching for something, and all those things are fleeting when you think that you're going to feel something, whether it's you having bad performance and trying to fill that void with some kind of temporary fulfillment in a sense. But what you see in college a lot of times is guys that, like I said, that are just, they may have their faith, but they're scared to speak up because they don't know if other people are going to be like, dude, why are you talking about that right now? Like, are you one of those you're one of those Christian people that's they're judging everybody because we don't believe the same thing that you believe. And so I think it's one of those things where you definitely have guys that have formed Bible studies and things. Like, we had a Bible study when I was in college, and it's a very, very small group of guys that are involved in that. And then there's also FCA. So like I said, there are people and events that the guys get invited to. It's just whether they show up or not, and in college, when you don't have your mom and dad there to suggest that you go or to make you go, a lot of times there's guys that don't. And there were times that I didn't go that I should have gone, and I look back and I regret not spending more time involved in FCA. I thought I was too busy sometimes. Mm-hmm. And you're never too busy for God. He's he's the reason why we're here and the reason why we're breathing.
Yeah. So outside of that group, that you had like a Bible study with, what did you have any ability, like I guess you specifically, or were there any examples that you had where you were able to share your faith with other guys on the team that you figured probably didn't have that same faith? Yes,
I can think of a couple of specific examples. I had one guy one time, I think it was my sophomore year. He was a senior, and he was a guy that would kind of always, he would harass like the guys on the team that were Christians. Just basically, that he'd hear them talking about something about their faith, and he'd just start openly laughing at them, and trying to play devil's advocate all the time with them about stuff. And so it was a guy that I liked, but also really pushed my buttons and got on my nerves, because I didn't know why he even felt the need to, if he didn't agree with us about something, just kind of keep it to yourself, or don't cause a big, at least don't, I guess, interrogate people about it. I think there's a way to go about it if you want to challenge somebody's beliefs. But the way that he was doing it was very much so like harassment. And so we had a bowl game at the end of that year, and this guy, we got into this pretty deep conversation at some point, because one of the guys on the team had a tattoo of Jesus on his arm, and it was kind of Jesus where he's sweating blood, and he's looking up to the heavens, and the guy on the team makes a comment about like, oh, who's that, Jesus? And he goes, yeah, it's Jesus. And he goes, he looks high. And if anybody that sees Jesus as their Lord and Savior, that's going to be offensive to them. And so right then I couldn't help it. I popped off to him and I don't remember the exact words that I said, but I remember confronting him about, like, why would you say that about somebody that is, like, you know how near and dear this is to our heart. Like, why would you say that? And he basically said, I don't have a problem with the theology necessarily of Christianity. I have a problem with the people and the way that what they say they believe and then how they actually live. I see this dude that has a Jesus on his arm out on 6th Street every weekend. I see him making terrible decisions, the same decisions I'm making, and I'm not a professing, believer. And so for me, it was kind of eye-opening to see he's right. To see, you see people that represent a certain faith, but yet they don't live like, they don't show the fruits of that. But at the same time, you can't judge a whole faith, the theology and everything off of what certain people are doing, because we all are, we're all messed up, and we can't all do everything perfect all the time. So you got to judge what the theology is and not the people, and their choices that they make. But anyways, that was something that to me was really eye-opening, and we had this big long talk and discussion about everything. Well, he calls me a few months later out of the blue after he graduated, and he's like almost on the verge of tears, and he said, hey, I just want to let you know that I appreciate I've been thinking a lot about that conversation that we had. And he said, I've had some pretty tragic events happen recently in my life where 2 of my grandparents have passed away, and it's very hard for me to cope with and deal with. Am I going to see them again or not? And he said, basically, he had said he'd been thinking a lot about it, and he's in his first steps of trying to come to the faith,
Yeah,
and it was
awesome.
really cool because this guy was harassing, us.
Yeah.
And he at one point had said way back in the summer, he asked somebody if they were going to church on Sunday, and they said, yeah. He said, I'm going to 1 in a million. That's my church, And so it was that kind of stuff that you would deal with. And
Yeah.
the other example is a kid that he believed that we came from monkeys, and he had always been a science guy his whole life, biology major. And so, it was everything that he'd been taught in the textbooks. They teach that stuff in the textbooks. And so, I said, do you seriously, you really believe that we came from monkeys? Yeah, I do. And so we got into some long drawn out talks and everything. And, it was kind of one of those things where I didn't know if I'd actually planted a seed with him or not,
Yeah.
And a year later, I'm in church at the Austin Stone downtown campus, and I look down, and this dude's raising his hands, and I'm I start tearing up. And it was pretty crazy, and I went up and talked to him afterwards, and he's like my life has changed, And so a couple examples of just being able to, through football and through being a teammate with someone and them getting to know you as a person and watching your actions, because I think your actions are always going to speak so much louder than any words that you say, because if you say something but you're not living it out at all, it's not a very, very good example for those that aren't yet believers,
Yeah.
So I'm not saying I'm perfect by any means, but I'm a big believer that, if you say that you believe in something, then there should be evidence that you believe in that.
Yeah. What is the difference between the community that you had, and teams are obviously brotherhoods in their own right, but what is the difference between the community that you had with teammates who you didn't share the faith with and community that you had with teammates that you did?
I say just in terms of being teammates, not a whole lot.
Okay.
It's when you're a part of a team, it's a one unit.
Yeah.
But I say just as relationships in general, outside of being on the football team, you definitely feel like you have a stronger bond, a closer tie with someone who's also a fellow believer, because there's one common goal, one common faith, and there's one common objective, I guess, if you will, and you find your value there, your identity there, and so you can relate so much in that. I think with others that aren't believers, they may not be some of the things that you may hold dear to your heart, or some of the things that you may think are important. They may not think that at all. They may think it's foolish, and so I think that's the biggest thing, is people that are believers tend to have similar beliefs, similar morals in a sense, and so it's a lot easier, I think, to feel like that you're right along pushing each other.
Yeah.
Whereas if you have someone who's a believer and an unbeliever, it's hard to be feeling like you're being pushed by that unbeliever, obviously, because they don't believe the same things that you believe.
Going to a school like the University of Texas, where it's just, one of the biggest media markets for a college football team in the country. It's just, exposure all the time with just the pressure that comes with that. Did you ever have any, moments, games, any times that you can think of where you felt challenged in your identity just because of the pressure that came with going to a school like the University of Texas and playing football?
Personally, I don't think so with my faith. There were a lot of ways that I was challenged by being in front of the media. I used to be someone who was like, pretty shy, hated to be in front of a camera, hated to give any kind of public speaking at all. And so it was more so from that front of like, they just thrust you into the spotlight, and now it's like, here, all these cameras around you, and you have to try to be yourself and all that. But as far as just challenging your faith and all that, in high pressure situations and all that, I don't think so. I liked the feeling of pressure when it came to football, because pressure to me meant like the stakes are higher, but that's a good thing or a bad thing. If you see it as a good thing, it's like, you make a big play in a high pressure situation where everyone's watching, and it's a huge deal, So it's high risk, high reward, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah.
And so I enjoyed that part of football, because when it was a clutch situation or a high pressure situation, that's when I was like, I want the ball, because I wanted to be able to try to do something for the team in a high pressure situation when it really counted. I will say the one thing, I guess, media wise, that may have somewhat affected my faith is just not being as open as I wish I would have been with the audience that I had at that moment in time. I look back and think, man, think about the amount of people that watch those football games. Not only is there over 100,000 in the stands, but there are millions across the world that are watching this game. And what would it mean to them in a post-game interview or something like that? If I could share one little, one small thing about my faith or something. I wish I would have portrayed, how much my faith was a big part of my life at that point when I had a platform that was the biggest that I'll ever have.
Right.
There's a lot of things that you can do going from the University of Texas on, but the biggest, I guess, platform that I had was when I was at the University of Texas. And so there's a part of me that wishes I would have spoken up a little more.